And so we're John chapter 12 this morning, and I'm going to read the first 8 verses. I hope that you have your Bible or something with your Bible on it. If not, follow along so that you can see and read what I read for you. John chapter 12, verse 1, Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with Jesus. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people?" Now he said this, not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." At what point does something become extravagant? Think about that word. At what point does something become extravagant? When does something become too much? What is the line between appropriate and extravagant? And the answer is, it depends. It depends. It depends on what we're talking about. It depends on who we're talking about. And it depends on the circumstances that we're talking about. One man's appropriate might be another man's extravagant. Is $100 too much? Now don't answer out loud. Is $100 too much to pay for a meal in a nice restaurant on a special occasion? Well, the answer is it depends. It depends. Do I make $50,000 a year or do I make $200,000 a year? Is it a special occasion or is it a Tuesday in November, right? It depends whether it's extravagant or not. I might give my wife a gift that for us is an extravagance, but for you it might be nothing. It's not all that significant. I might look at somebody and think that their car is extravagant. You might look at my car and think that it's extravagant. It just all is relative to the person, to the situation, to the circumstances. Extravagant is in the eye of the beholder, to borrow from an old proverb. However, with all that being said, I think we would agree that what Mary did here in these verses was extravagant. It was extravagant. This act of worship, this expression of her love for Jesus is nothing short of extravagant. Overboard, too much, over the top, a waste, unreasonable, indefensible. Whatever you might want to say of those words about what Mary did, those people that day thought it. That's what they were thinking as they watched Mary do that. But what did Jesus think about what Mary did to express to him her great love? Mary is an interesting character in the Bible, if for no other reason than her consistency. Whenever we see Mary, she's doing the same thing, and it's a good thing. 3 times Mary takes center stage in the New Testament, and all 3 times, you know what she's doing? She's worshiping at the feet of Jesus. That's a pretty good thing to do, isn't it? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus, showing him her love, pouring her heart out to him, just worshiping him. She is consistent. You can criticize her if you want to, but I will tell you that her focus was single-mindedly on Jesus. And I, for one, could use a little bit more of Mary in me as I try to focus on Jesus. The setting of this act of extravagance is very interesting. Somebody called it the strangest dinner party in the history of mankind. Why would anybody say that? Why would they say this is a strange dinner party? Well, just look at some of the people who are there. For one thing, you got Lazarus, right? Lazarus, just a few days before this, was in the grave, right? Remember from last week's sermon? He's the same one that had been dead for 4 days, and Jesus showed up, and he was no longer dead. Well, Lazarus was there at that dinner party. How many times can you go to a dinner party where you've got somebody there eating with you who was dead a few days ago, right? And of course, you've got Jesus, who's alive then, but in a few days is going to be dead. What an interesting party, right? On one side, I got a guy who was dead and is now alive. On the other side, I got a guy who's alive that's about to be dead. And then, of course, you got Judas, the soon-to-be but not yet betrayer of Jesus. He was there. Nobody knew the kind of person that Judas really was. They really didn't. Even the disciples, those who were closest to him, didn't know what Judas was about to do. Only Jesus knew, and Judas. So it's an interesting setting for this act. The timing of this extravagance is also important. And John made sure, if you go back and look at verse 1, John made sure we knew the timing of this. He said that it was 6 days before the Passover. So what John is telling us in hindsight, it's in hindsight, right? John knew this. John is saying this happened right at the end of Jesus' life. This happened right at the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. So this was Saturday. Are you thinking in your mind about a timeline? This was Saturday that this happened. And the next day, the next Sunday, Jesus would start that march toward Jerusalem. And so we know what's going to happen there, right? On that Passover. And so here it is Saturday, and by Friday, Jesus was going to be hanging on the cross. And so Saturday, a celebration. The next Friday, a crucifixion. An interesting change of events. And do you think that maybe Mary sensed what was coming? Do you think she had eyes to see, you know what? This guy, Jesus, he has riled up the wrong people too much, and it's about to come crashing down. Do you think maybe she had the intuition that many women have, that most of us men don't, that this might be her last chance to do something like this for Jesus? I don't know. The text doesn't tell us that, but I just wonder about that. This is about worship. John talked about worship. This is about worship and what we see in this. It's about extravagant worship. And I want us to pull some things out of this morning. First of all, taking notes, you can jot this down maybe. Extravagant worship reveals what we love the most. Extravagant worship reveals what we love the most. Here's the thing we know. If this act of worship was over the top for Mary, then what that tells us is her love for Jesus was over the top. Because this act of worship, extravagance, sprang out of and flowed from a heart that loved Jesus more than she loved anything else. So what does this act of extravagant worship tell us about Mary? She loved Jesus extravagantly. She loved Jesus the most. Nobody worships someone or something the way Mary did unless he loves that thing or that person over the top. So what do we know about Mary? She loved Jesus more than she loved anything else in the world. And that's why she worshiped the way she did. Look at the truth. This kind of worship reveals who we love the most. She loved Jesus. He was a priority of her heart. There were no divided loyalties when it came to Mary and how she related to Jesus. There was no lukewarmness. She was not wishy-washy. She was not complacent in her love for Jesus. And it showed in her worship. But now, watch this. Guess who else there that night revealed what they loved the most as they worshiped? Watch me. The answer is Judas. Judas. You say, well, Judas wasn't worshiping Jesus. Well, you're half right. Judas wasn't worshiping Jesus, but guess what Judas was worshiping by his actions that night? He was worshiping his God, the one he loved the most, and guess what that was? It was money. Judas was a worshiper. Mary was here by Jesus worshiping the one that she loved the most extravagantly, and here was Judas. He would in a few moments reveal what he loved the most by his worship, and it was money. Judas was a thief, and he was greedy, and he loved money more than he loved Jesus, and that's what he worshiped. And you see that played out in his life. Judas objected strenuously to what Mary did. He was indignant. Notice, watch me, notice his very spiritual sounding defense of this. He said, why was this money not sold and given to the poor? Doesn't that sound spiritual? You know, there are people who don't love Jesus as much as they should, but they can sound very spiritual at times. And that was Judas. He sounded very spiritual, but the Bible says, if you look at it again in verse 6, he wasn't really concerned about the poor. Who was he concerned about? He was concerned about himself because he was a thief, and because they let him keep the money. He kept the treasury, right? He kept the money bag. He signed the checks because they trusted him. They didn't know what he was. He wanted that $300 to come into the little treasury, so he didn't have access to that. He was a thief. He loved money more than he loved Jesus. Money was his idol, and that's what he worshiped the most, because that's what he loved the most. Mary showed what she loved the most by how she worshiped, and so did Judas. I want you to hear me in this. People will always show you what they love the most by what they worship the most passionately. If you just watch people, examine their lives a little bit, listen to them talk, they will always reveal to you eventually what they love the most by how they worship, and by what they give their attention to, and by what they spend their time on, and by what gets them excited, and about what makes them passionate, and what, when everything else is silent, what they start talking about. People will always eventually reveal the number one in their heart by the way they live. I know Christians, people who claim that they love Jesus, but if you look at their life, you see their priorities don't have Jesus in number one spot like Mary did. You say, well, how can you tell that? Well, just watch their life a little bit. What do they spend the most of their time on? What do they spend the most of their gifts and abilities on? What do they do when there's nothing else to do, when there's no requirements of them? What do they like to talk about? What would they give up before they give up Jesus? You see, you can look at somebody's life to see what they worship passionately, to see what their true love is. That's just the way we are. Watch me. All of us worship, in a sense, what we love the most. That's just the way the human mind and heart is built. What we love the most is what we gravitate to and give the best of ourselves to. It might be money, like Judas. It might be something else. It might be pleasure. It might be entertainment. It might be power. It might be comfort. It might be status. It might be a job or a career. It might just be self, right? Most of us fall there. For somebody who doesn't love Jesus the most, they will find every reason possible to worship what they do love the most. That's complicated. I shouldn't have worded it that way. What I mean to say is, if they love something else other than Jesus, they'll always find time for that thing. If they love a hobby or a pastime or another person or if they love that person the most, more than anything else in their life, you can absolutely know that they're going to find time for that, even though they may not find any time for Jesus. Right? They're not going to find time for Jesus, but they'll find time for that. Why? They love that, whatever that is, fill in the blank, more than they love anything else. We worship the most what we love the most. I wonder what our worship, when I say worship, I'm not talking about what takes place an hour here on Sunday morning. I'm talking about the entirety of our life, right? I wonder what our worship says about what we love the most. I wonder if we were dead level honest this morning, would we say, like Mary, that we love Jesus more than we love anything else? Oh, that be the testimony of our heart, right? My heart and your heart. So first of all, extravagant worship reveals what we love the the most. Secondly, we see that extravagant worship always costs us something. Always costs us something to worship like Mary worshiped, extravagantly. It's not going to be cheap. As we can tell from Mary's example, it's not going to be cheap. It is not budget friendly in all of areas of our life to worship extravagantly, and involves money and resources, of course, but I'm talking about things that are way more important than that too. Mary is an example of how costly it is to worship Jesus like this. Look at what it cost her. And part of it is financial. You can't get around that. That's what the text is all about. She had this perfume, and it was probably her most valuable possession. It was an asset, right? It's not something you buy at Belk, right, for $50. You probably can't buy a perfume for $50. It's not like that. This is a family treasure. It's an heirloom. She kept it in a safety deposit box, right? Some people would say she wasted it, right, when she got it out. Nard is his name. You like that name? Or if you were marketing, could you sell that, right? I can't see a commercial. But that's the substance. It was very expensive. It was from India or China. And so to get it there added to the expense. And the texts tell us that it was pure nard. In other words, they didn't take something else, some oil, and dilute it to make it go further. It was the real deal. It was just that pure substance. And that's why it was so valuable. It was such an asset. It was so expensive. And of course, the thief, Judas, helps us know exactly what it was worth. He says it's worth 300 denarii. Money-hungry people always know what things cost. Have you noticed that? Greedy people will always tell you what things cost because they know that. Why? Because that's what they think about. It's what they calculate. It's what they worship. It's what they love. There are people, I'm not talking about any of y'all, there are people in the church, not our church, somebody else's church, whose first question about something is always, how much does it cost? And never, how much is this going to glorify God? How much is this going to get the gospel out there? Right? Cost is important because things are expensive. But the most important thing is, how is this going to glorify God? Right? Judas knew exactly how much that stuff was worth. Right? He says 300 denarii. You know how much that is? That's about the yearly salary of an average common laborer in that day. Right? 300 denarii. Denarii is what an average worker made for one day's common labor. So you're talking a year's salary for a guy that's going to work in the field, something like that. It's a lot of money, right? It's a lot of money for a house, for a car, for a boat. But what about a bottle of perfume? See why we call this extravagant? All of that money on this one thing was probably the most valuable thing she owned. And what did she do? She broke it and poured it all out on Jesus' feet in an act of worship. And I'm reading between the lines, but I believe if Mary were here, she would say something like this: I wish I'd only had another bottle and I'd have done the same thing. And I never regretted it for 1 minute. Why? Because she loved Jesus that much. And she was willing to give this very expensive, extravagant gift for that. Now, does God require us to give away our most valuable possession? Right? Our most valuable financial resource in order to worship Him? Of course not. But you know what He does require us to give up in order to worship Him? Our love of money. You can't love money the most and love Jesus the most at the same time. Jesus Himself said that. He said you'll very soon start to love one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other. He won't require you to give up your money to worship Him, but He will require you to give up your love of money to worship Him. It costs you something. The real issue is not how much this cost, but how much did she love Jesus? Watch me. Because once she figured out how much she loved Jesus, the cost didn't matter. Our issue today for you and for me, I'm saying this for me as much as anybody, is not how much we own, but how much we love Jesus. Because once we figure out how much we love Jesus, it doesn't really matter how much we own. We're willing to give it to Him, right? because it's his anyway, but that's a different sermon. Bottom line is, if I love him like I ought to, nothing that I own will stand in the way of me worshiping him, because I love him the most. But there was more than just money for this act of worship. It cost her more than that. Look in verse 3. What does it say that Mary did in verse 3? She did something that was so shocking for a woman in that day of her position. She took down her hair and she used it to wipe the perfume into Jesus' feet, or into Jesus' feet, or off of Jesus' feet. Why? Did she not remember to take a towel? I don't think that was it. I think this was just a spontaneous kind of thing. You might think one thing about that. You might think, ooh, gross, right? You know, my mind is tempted to say something like, ladies, when's the last time? No, I'm not going to go there. We don't have an understanding really of how shocking that was in that day, because only women of ill repute, right, who had a certain reputation would do that. Women only took their hair down in the presence of their husband in private. So this broke all kinds of taboos. It said about her something that obviously was not true, but people could assume. She was so caught up in loving Jesus that it seemed fitting for her to take down her dignity, right, her reputation, and to pour that out on Jesus' feet as well. I can only imagine the gasp from the other people there. Her sister Mary, remember practical Mary, who loved Jesus through service? Imagine what her reaction would be. I mean, she was speechless, right? But guess what? She didn't care. Mary didn't care, because she was so caught up in worshiping Jesus, it didn't matter to her what the ladies in town might whisper about her when she goes to market the next day. She just didn't care, because she loved Jesus that much. I wonder sometimes if we care more about what people think about us than what God thinks about us. I wonder if we're reserved and restrained in our service for Jesus because we're afraid people might think we're too much, that we're over the top, that we're a Jesus fanatic. I wonder if what people think about us, our reputation, keeps us from worshiping and loving Jesus like we ought to sometimes. This cost Mary something. Does our worship ever cost us anything? I'm asking myself. Do we ever give a gift that's so extravagant, maybe financially, that if people knew about it, they would think we're crazy? We ever done anything like that? We ever made a decision to serve Jesus and our friends and our family kind of question us like, are you sure about this? This doesn't make any sense to me. I'm just not so sure you're doing the right thing. Have you ever done anything to follow Jesus that might cost you your social standing, your reputation, as it were, right? People think a certain thing of you, right? You're popular, you fit in. You get invited to the right kind of parties and dinners, and you fit in with the right crowd at school. You sit at the cool kids table, right? Do they still have that, Kyle? You're not for that cool kids table. Have you ever done anything that might get you kicked off the cool kids table? Right? Not in a bad way. Serving Jesus and loving Him. I'm not sure it's possible, hear me, I'm not sure it's possible these days for us to really love and serve Jesus and keep our popularity in this culture. We're weird, right, today. We're weird. Thirdly, extravagant worship sometimes brings criticism. Sometimes brings criticism. What a beautiful scene this was. And if we could just stop at one point before we get to verse 4, right, would be good. It's a beautiful act of worship, an extravagant love that Mary showed to Jesus. But the fact is, sometimes when you do something like that, people are going to criticize you. They're going to complain about it. They're not going to understand if you do something like Mary did. They just don't understand. You see in verse 4, Judas expressing that. Why was this perfume not sold? He said. Criticized Mary. Can you imagine criticizing Mary for what she was doing to Jesus, and Jesus was sitting there, right? But he did. Though, listen now, Those who don't love Jesus enough will always criticize those that they think love Jesus too much. You get that? Those who don't love Jesus enough will always criticize those who they think love Jesus too much. If you go overboard on your love for Jesus, somebody's probably going to criticize you. They're probably going to question it. They're probably going to maybe call you aside and say, you know what, you can be a Christian without being this much of a Christian. What do you mean, giving up this? What do you mean doing this? What do you mean doing this? Don't you know that's just too much? Judas was not the only one. In Mark's account of the same event, it says that some others were indignant about it. Well, who is that? Well, it could have just been part of the crowd there, but Matthew zeroes in. Matthew says some of the other disciples joined Judas in their indignation about this. Mary, what are you doing? You realize what that's worth? You know what we could do with that? You know how much we could give to missions? Right? You know how many poor people we could feed with that? They joined in because they didn't understand Mary's great love for Jesus. So what we get from this is the closest one to Jesus and the ones who should have loved him as much as Mary did criticize Mary for loving Jesus too much. Don't be surprised if you make a bold step for Jesus and following him, or take a bold stand in worshiping him or loving him. Don't be surprised if the ones who criticize you the most are those who claim they also love Jesus. Why would the world criticize you? They don't care. In this case, Mary's case, she got criticism from the ones closest to her and to Jesus. Don't they always expect a pat on the back if you give up something valuable to serve Jesus? Some people will applaud you. Some will think that you've wasted your life. Think about that word waste. How would you like to be told that your life's work is nothing but a waste? That would hurt, wouldn't it? How would you like to be told that the greatest sacrifice you've made is nothing but a waste? It's kind of what Mary was told here. Mary, what a waste this is. You think you've made this great sacrifice? You have no idea. To some, giving up the best that we have to Jesus is a waste. Giving up your week of your summer to serve the Lord on a mission trip or in vacation Bible school is a waste. You'll never get that week back. Giving up a lucrative career or business opportunity to serve the Lord is a waste. What are you thinking? Giving up popularity or friends or social standing or a certain lifestyle is a waste. You should look up sometime the story of William Borden. He was an heir to the Borden dairy dynasty. And as a young man, he decided he was going to give his life serving Jesus. And it's a long story. It's a wonderful story. But the people around him said, "You're wasting your life. What are you doing? You've got this business empire over here, and you're going to step into it and be worth hundreds of millions." He said, "I don't want any of that. I just want to serve Jesus." He went to the mission field, and right in the beginning of his mission career at the age of 25, he caught a disease and he died. And you know what the people around him said? Such a waste. It wasn't, was it? It wasn't. It's never a waste when we extravagantly worship Jesus. This wasn't a waste for Mary to worship Jesus like this. It just wasn't. Somebody said that many in the church will never have a problem with moderate, measured devotion to Christ. But if you walk away from something important to do it, they'll say you're wasting your life. I want to be the kind of person, and I hope you do too, at the end of our life, when people look at us, they say, "You know what? Others may thought he wasted his life, but I think he served it, lived it, giving to Jesus." The last thing, real quickly, give me 5 minutes. Extravagant worship is always commended by God. It's always commended by God. What did man say about Mary's sacrificial, extravagant worship? Well, we just said, right? How does God respond to that kind of devotion? In Mark's account, Jesus said to those critics, right? To his disciples, to the critics, "Leave her alone. She's done a good thing for me." Jesus put his stamp of approval on Mary's sacrifice. Jesus put a stamp of commendation on this extravagant act of love. He went on to say, you're always going to have the poor to take care of, and you ought to, but Mary's taken this opportunity to anoint me for burial. Maybe she knows something that you don't know, right? She's done a good thing. It's one thing to live your life and be commended by men. Somebody stand up at your funeral and say wonderful, glowing things. He was a great father. He was a great husband. He built a great business. He was a good neighbor. He was a good mechanic, right? He was a good Alabama fan. It's a good, or Auburn, or Tennessee. It's good. That's good. I hope people can say that. But I want to be commended by God for how I waste my life. Don't you? And this kind of worship that we're talking about is the very thing that's commended by God. Not noticed by man. Not applauded by man. Not cheered. Oh boy, he's doing the wise thing. But commended by God. Right? That's the kind of person who when they see Jesus, right, I can only imagine, maybe hears those words, well done, good and faithful servant. You wasted your life for me. You wasted your life on me. Extravagant worship. I want you to stand. Your heads bowed and your eyes closed, and music will begin to play, and I just want you to think about those things and where your life is headed and how you're living it and what you're giving your best to and what you really love the most. And what will people say about you at the end of your life, but more importantly, what will God say? Will you be commended for your extravagant love and worship? If you're watching us online this morning, I invite you, if you have some type of spiritual decision, you can contact us with that number at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be glad to talk to you. If you're in this building, come to this altar and pray if God leads you to do that. I'll be here. I'll watch for you. If you need to come, you come.